The hall was quieter than it had any right to be, given how many people stood inside it. Sable counted the torches along the western wall out of habit, the way she counted anything when her hands had nothing useful to do. 14 torches, 2 guttering near the high arch where the draft came through. The smoke pooled at the ceiling like a held thought, and below it, arranged in their precise order of rank, the assembled packs of the northern territories waited for a king to name his consort. She was not supposed to be visible. Elder Draven had made that clear when the summons went out. Ward girls stood at the hall's eastern margin, behind the ranked wolves, behind the titled families, behind even the lower pack emissaries who had ridden 2 days through the autumn cold to be present. Ward girls stood where the architecture put them, at the edge, in the shadow, past the last torch. She had obeyed, because obeying was what 11 years of wardship had taught her to do, and she pressed her back against the cold stone and watched the hall fill the way a tide fills a harbor, deliberate and indifferent to anything small enough to be swept. Then the doors opened. The air changed before he appeared. The assembled wolves felt it first, some old instinct pulling their shoulders back, their chins up, their voices to silence. The silence itself had a shape. It pressed outward from the doorway like a wave from a stone dropped in deep water, and Sable, at the hall's eastern margin, 19 years old, her healer's apron still faintly stained with the willow bark tincture she had been mixing when Cress came to fetch her, felt it reach her too. Victor Thornwood walked into the hall the way a storm walks into an open country. He was 26. She had known that from Mira's quiet recitations of pack dates, the way Mira knew everything that bore on the health and safety of the people under her care. 26 Alpha King since his 23rd year returned to Thornwood Hall for the first time in 3 years to discharge a political duty before the High Council. Sable had filed that information in the part of her mind where she kept facts that did not concern her, alongside the flowering schedules of mountain herbs and the drying times for rendered fat. She had not filed what it would feel like to see him. His gaze moved across the hall with the patience of someone reading a room he has read 100 times before, cataloging, weighing, finding nothing that surprised him. And then it stopped. Not at Elder Draven, who stood at the council dais in his formal gray robes with his hands folded over a sealed document. Not at Lady Vera, who was positioned at the dais's left in a gown the color of winter birch, her neck long and her expression arranged to suggest she had already accepted an outcome everyone else was still waiting to hear. Victor's gaze stopped at the hall's eastern margin, where the ward girls stood in their half-visibility, and it stopped specifically on Sable. She looked away first. Her face felt warm in the cold of the stone wall. He crossed to the dais. The ceremony began its formal opening, Draven's voice rising in the old cadence of pack law, and Sable concentrated on the guttering torches and told herself that a king's gaze crossing a room was not the same as a king seeing anything. She had been telling herself versions of that sentence for 11 years. 11 years back, she had been 8 years old and the border had been bleeding. The raid that took the settlement at Anvers Crossing left 3 dead and a dozen wounded, and Sable had been among the wounded, though she had not known how badly until later, when the cold stopped feeling like cold and started feeling like nothing at all. She remembered the smell of burnt wood and the sound of shouting that kept moving further away, and then a pair of hands lifting her that were not her mother's hands, because her mother was not there, had not been there for 2 years by then. The hands were 15-year-old Victor Thornwood's, who had been riding the border with a small patrol, more boy than king, but already carrying the command instinct in his shoulders, and he had found her behind the collapsed wall of the settlement healer's outpost and carried her to the healers himself, refusing to let anyone take her from him until he had delivered her safely into Mira's care. Mira had told her this. Sable had not been conscious for most of it. She remembered waking to Mira's warm hands and a fire close enough to feel on her cheek. and the faint impression of someone standing in the doorway who was too tall to be Mira and too still to be anyone afraid. He had waited until she opened her eyes. Then he had left. She had spent 11 years learning to be useful in the place where he had left her, studying Mira's craft with the focused appetite of someone who understood, at 8 years old and increasingly clearly with each passing year, that ward girls did not have the luxury of being ornamental. She knew which roots drew fever out of the blood and which thickened it. She knew the proper pressure for a wrapped joint and the wrong sounds a chest made when fluid was collecting where it should not. She could read the color of a wound and tell you within 2 days when it would turn, and she had been right often enough that even the pack wolves who did not acknowledge her by name acknowledged her by the result. Mira had seen to it that she was housed, fed, taught, and quietly protected from the worst of what Draven's faction thought was the appropriate use of ward girls. Cress, who had arrived at wardship 3 years after Sable, and was smaller and sharper, and constitutionally unable to let an injustice pass in silence, had become the kind of companion who tells you when your face is giving you away, and means it as a kindness. "The ward debt inventory," Draven announced, his voice carrying the particular satisfaction of a man who has been waiting for a specific audience, "will be confirmed and reassigned before the formal claim proceeding. Any ward present in this hall who cannot demonstrate pack standing is to be removed to the outer corridor." He looked at the eastern margin when he said it. Sable had been told to stand at the eastern margin. The look lasted precisely long enough to be intentional and not long enough to be challenged. Around her, 2 of the other ward girls moved toward the door without being specifically named, the way people with no standing learn to move when authority shapes itself into a pointing finger. Sable stayed where she was. Her hands were clasped in front of her apron. Her breathing was even. She had spent 11 years learning to hold still in rooms where she was not supposed to matter, and she was very good at it. Draven was still looking at her. "The ward girl from Healer Mira's household," he said. The hall noticed. She felt the noticing before she saw it, a slight reorientation of the room, the way a compass needle moves before anyone watching the compass understands why. She kept her eyes on the dais and said nothing, because no one had asked her a question yet, and answering things that were not questions was a mistake wards made only once. "She has no pack standing," Draven continued, now addressing the hall in general, as though Sable were a procedural matter already settled. "She has no bloodline on record, no bond mark, no ranked sponsor. Her presence in this hall during a formal claim proceeding is irregular. I am invoking council authority to have her escorted out." "That will not be necessary." The words came from the dais, and they were not Draven's. Victor had not moved from his position. He was standing with his hands at his sides in the particular stillness of a man who does not need to perform authority because he has simply never not had it. He had not raised his voice. He did not need to. "She stays," he said. Draven's composure held, though something behind his eyes flickered and did not quite settle. "My lord, the procedural integrity of a claim proceeding requires that all present hold verified standing. The ward girl does not qualify under the 7th article of the old pack law." "The 7th article," Victor said, "specifies verified standing for those who would contest the claim. She is not contesting. She is standing." The distinction hung in the air of the hall, the way a knife hangs at the highest point of a throw. Draven bowed, shallow and precise. "Of course, my lord." The proceeding resumed. Sable breathed. She did not look at Victor. She looked at the guttering torches and told herself that a king intervening in a procedural matter was a king protecting procedural order, not a ward girl he had last seen at 8 years old and unconscious. That was the rational reading. She held onto it with both hands. Cress found her at the first recess, slipping through the edge of the crowd the way Cress had always moved, low and fast and certain of her route. She pressed close to Sable's side and kept her voice at the level of a breath. "He issued an order," she said, before the hall filled. "To the wolf captain at the south door. I was in the corridor when it went out." Sable looked at her. "What order?" "That no ward from Mira's household was to be removed from the hall grounds during the proceedings, regardless of standing challenges." Cress's eyes were bright with the particular light of someone who has seen a thing that does not fit the category she was given for it. "He said it by your name, Sable. Not by household. By your name." The rational reading she had been holding onto shifted under her like ground that was not as solid as it had looked. She turned back toward the hall. That evening, after the first session had adjourned, a pack wolf named Aldrich came to the healer's corridor with a wound that should have waited for morning and did not. He was one of the younger fighters from the Western Border Patrol, 20 years old and embarrassed about the suppurating cut along his forearm that he had been ignoring for 3 days on the theory that cuts healed themselves if you waited long enough. This one had not. Sable looked at it in the corridor lamplight and felt the particular cold clarity she always felt when a wound told her something the patient had not. The edges had gone the wrong color, a deep rose fading to gray at the center, and the skin around it was pulling tight the way skin pulled when something inside it was losing the argument. "Sit," she said, and pointed at the bench. He sat. She went for Mira's kit, and Mira came with her, and together they worked while Aldrich gripped the bench edge and tried not to make any sounds that would register as sounds. It was the kind of wound that required drawing out before it could be closed, which was the kind of procedure that required the patient to hold very still while things were done to him that felt precisely as bad as they were. And Aldrich held still because Sable's voice, when she said, "Hold still," apparently left no room for negotiation. She did not know Victor was in the corridor until Mira looked up once, and then looked back down at her hands and said nothing, which was Mira's way of saying something was present that Sable should be aware of, but did not need to respond to. Sable did not look up. She finished the drawing, packed the wound with the dry moss compound that Mira had taught her at 12 years old, by making her grind it herself until she understood why the grind mattered, and wrapped the arm in clean linen with the precise tension that would keep the packing in place without cutting the circulation. She tied it off. She told Aldrich to come back in 2 days, not 3, and that if the skin around the wrap went hot before then, he was to find her immediately, and not wait for it to seem polite. Aldrich said he would. She believed him about 40%. When she turned to wash her hands at the basin, she registered the stillness in the corridor that meant someone of significant presence was standing in it, and then she saw him. He was leaning his shoulder against the stone of the arch, which was the most informal posture she had seen him take since he arrived. He looked at her with an expression she could not categorize. It was not the procedural scrutiny of the hall. It was something quieter than that, and it sat in his face the way things sit in a face when a person sees a thing that confirms something they already knew but had not yet let themselves know. "The boy should have come sooner," he said. "He should have," she agreed, and kept her voice at the same register she used with any patient. Steady. Informative. Without an invitation for further conversation, because she did not know what kind of conversation this was, and she had learned, over 11 years, to be careful about the kinds of conversation she invited. Victor did not say anything else. He looked at her hands once, at the basin, at the wrapped arm she had just left Aldrich with, and then he left the corridor. She stood with her clean hands at her sides and tried to organize what had just happened into something she could understand. She could not. The next morning brought the council session that mattered. Sable knew it mattered the way she knew things that were not told to her directly, but were carried in the texture of the air, in the tightness of Mira's jaw over breakfast, in the way Cress appeared at her door before the 6th bell and said, "Come to the hall early," without explaining why. She came to the hall early. She stood at the eastern margin again. 14 torches, 2 still guttering. Draven opened the session with a document. He carried it in both hands, which was the formal gesture for materials of weight, and he placed it on the council table with the deliberateness of a man placing a stone on a path he intends to make someone walk. The document was sealed, and even from the eastern margin, Sable could see that the seal was red wax over a carved impression that she did not know well enough to read. "The High Council has before it," Draven said, "a formal betrothal contract between the House of Thornwood and the House of Vera, witnessed and sealed 11 months past at the Northern Conclave, naming Lady Vera as consort-elect of the Alpha King." The Hall absorbed this. Sable absorbed this. She had known, in the part of her mind where she kept facts that did not concern her, that the consort naming was the reason for Victor's return. She had not known there was already a contract. She did not allow her face to show that the distinction mattered to her, because it did not matter to her, because she was a ward girl at the eastern margin with no standing and no bloodline on record, and no logical reason to feel anything about who the Alpha King named as his consort. She told herself this with some precision and felt it precisely not work. Draven continued. "Under the terms of this contract, the Council moves to recognize Lady Vera's standing as consort-elect and requests the Alpha King's formal confirmation before these witnesses." Victor had not moved. He was standing at the head of the dais in the same manner he had stood since entering, with his hands at his sides and his attention distributed across the room in the way of someone who is always reading more than one thing at once. He looked at the document. He looked at the seal. "Bring it here," he said. Draven brought it himself, which was unusual, the kind of unusual that Sable filed away without knowing yet what shelf it belonged on. Victor took the document and examined the seal in the way a person examines something they expect to find a specific thing in. He turned the document over. He looked at the seal again from a different angle. "The Northern Conclave," he said, "uses the ashen iron impression. This seal is ashen bone." The silence that followed was of a different quality than the ceremonial silence the hall had been producing since the proceedings opened. This was the silence of a room that has just heard something fall from a height and is waiting to hear it hit the ground. Draven's composure held, but his hands moved. They moved one small time, the fingers closing slightly against his robes, and Sable saw it from the eastern margin because she watched hands the way healers watched hands, the way hands told you what the face was working not to show. "The impression was newly cut for the conclave," Draven said. "I was at the Northern Conclave," Victor said. "I have seen the ashen iron impression 300 times. I have never signed beneath an ashen bone seal." He placed the document on the council table and looked at Draven with an expression that did not need to be named. "This seal is not mine." The room breathed. Sable's hand had closed around the fabric of her apron without her noticing. She unclosed it. Draven said, "My lord, the conclave's records will confirm." And Victor said, "Then we will wait for the records." And for a moment the hall was very still in the specific way of a place where two versions of the truth are standing in the same space, and only one of them will remain standing at the close of proceedings. It was in that stillness that Sable made her decision. She had been aware, from the moment Draven produced the document, that the formal claiming sequence would follow its confirmation, and that once the council confirmed the claim, the old law sealed it, and anyone wishing to speak before the sealing had to do so inside the ceremony's formal margins. She had not known she was going to speak until she was already speaking. "Ward right of witness," she said. Her voice was not loud. She had not trained it to be loud. She had trained it to be clear, the way you trained your voice when you needed a patient in pain to hear exactly what you were telling them through the noise of their own distress. It was clear enough. The hall heard her. Draven turned. The expression on his face was the one she had expected. The arranged patience of a man who has just seen something small step into a place it was not supposed to occupy, and is already composing the language with which he will remove it. Ward girls do not have standing in a claim proceeding, he said. Ward right of witness predates standing classifications, Sable said. She looked at Mira, who was standing near the hall's south side, and Mira's face was doing something complicated and steady. It is an old law provision. Any ward present at a formal claiming ceremony may invoke the right to speak before the claim is sealed. The speaking is not a contest. It is a witness. The law makes that distinction. She is correct, Mira said from the south side of the hall. Draven's attention snapped toward Mira with the precision of a thing that has been interrupted in the middle of a move it was confident of. The ward right has not been invoked in 40 years. The ward right does not expire for non-use, Mira said. 3 of the 7 council elders were exchanging a look. Sable had been watching them across the room from the eastern margin long enough to have learned which way their attention moved when something came before them that they had not planned for. 2 of them, Elder Soran and Elder Pella, were old enough to have worked under the laws that predated Draven's reorganization of the council hierarchy. Their look said something that Sable could not fully read, but whose shape suggested the ward right was not the surprise Draven needed it to be. Under old law, Elder Saran said, her voice dry and precise as a well-ground blade, the ward right of witness is a valid procedural invocation. The ward girl may speak. Draven said nothing. His hands were closed against his sides. Sable turned to face the council and the assembled hall, and she chose her words the way she chose the right herb from a chest where many of the herbs looked similar, carefully, by what each one actually did. I was 8 years old, she said, when I was brought to Thornwood Hall as a ward. I have no pack bloodline on any council record, no bond mark, and no ranked sponsor. Elder Draven has named me a ward debt, which is the accurate term for what I am under the current council classification. She let that sit for one breath. I am not contesting the claim. I am asking the council to examine the contract they have been given, because the Alpha King has already noted that the seal on that document is not the seal used at the Northern Conclave. And I am asking what it means for a betrothal contract to carry a seal that the man it was signed for does not recognize. The hall was very quiet. Victor was watching her. Not the assessment of the throne room's formal proceeding, the quiet, confirming attention of someone who has been waiting to see a specific thing happen and has just seen it happen. She looked back toward the council and waited. Elder Soren picked up the document. She examined the seal for a long moment. She passed it to Elder Pela. Elder Pela held it to the lamp, turned it once, and said, in the voice of someone reading aloud from a page where the words were clear, Ash and Bone Impression. The Northern Conclave's recorded seal is ash and iron. These are different castes. Elder Draven, Victor said. Draven turned toward him. The contract your council has presented bears a seal I did not authorize, in an impression that does not match the Conclave's formal record, Victor said. You have asked this council to confirm a betrothal on the basis of a document I did not sign. I would like you to explain how that document came to carry a seal at all. Draven said, the Conclave's sealmaker may have. The Conclave's sealmaker is Oren Blackwood, Victor said. Oren Blackwood has cut the ash and iron impression for 17 years. If the impression on this document came from a different caste, it came from a different hand. I would like to know whose hand. The hall waited. Draven's composure finally did the thing that composure does when the weight on it exceeds its capacity. It did not break all at once. It thinned, the way ice thins at the places where the current runs beneath it, and through that thinning, briefly, the face of a man who had been certain this particular morning would go a particular way showed through the one it was not going. I prepared the document, he said, in service of the pack's political stability. In service of the pack, Victor said, or in service of your faction's interest in a Vera alliance, which your household has been pursuing since my father's last council session? There was no answer to that. Draven knew it. The three elders who were watching him knew it. Lady Vera, at the dais's left, was standing very still with her hands folded and her face set in the expression of someone who had not known the full shape of the mechanism she had agreed to stand inside, and the stillness of her face was the stillness of someone recalculating. Elder Soren said, "The council finds the presented contract invalid. The betrothal claim is without legal standing." Victor crossed the hall. He did not cross it toward the council or toward the dais or toward Lady Vera. He crossed it toward the eastern margin, where the 14 torches burned and 2 guttered near the arch, where the ward girls stood in their half-visibility. He crossed it toward Sable, and the hall parted for him without him asking, the way the hall had organized itself around him since the moment he walked through the main doors, and the silence that preceded him was the silence of a room that understood it was watching something that would not be undone. He stopped in front of her. She was looking up at him, and she was not going to look away this time, because she had already spent 11 years looking away, and she had run out of reasons to continue. He looked at the ward mark on her wrist. The mark was a small, pale crescent, the kind of mark Mira's healers carried when they had trained under the oldest bloodline traditions, the kind of mark that most of the hall would have read as the identifier of a healing apprentice and nothing more. Victor looked at it the way he had looked at the seal on the document, carefully, looking for the thing it actually was. "My father's healers carried that mark," he said quietly. "The ones who trained under the Ravenwood line." Sable had not known what the mark meant. Mira had put it on her wrist at 14, during an apprenticeship rite, and had told her it was the old way of acknowledging a healer in training, and had said nothing else, because Mira never said more than the moment required. She looked at Mira. Mira was looking back at her with the expression she had been wearing at certain moments across 11 years. The expression that was not quite readiness and not quite apology, and was, Sable understood now, the patient composure of someone who had known a thing she was not yet in a position to name. "The Ravenwood line," Victor said still quietly, "is the bloodline from which Thornwood Hall's original healer bond derived. It is not extinct. Its last documented carrier was a young woman who disappeared in the raid at Anvers Crossing 11 years ago." He paused. "She had a daughter." The hall understood before Sable did. She understood in the way you understand something your body has known for a long time and your mind has been waiting for permission to confirm. The cold of the stone wall was at her back. The 14 torches burned, 2 guttered. She looked at the mark on her wrist and then she looked at Victor and she did not say anything, because some things arriving do not require a response in the moment of their arrival. "Sable of Mira's household," Victor said, and his voice had the weight now of the formal address, the kind of weight that does not offer itself and does not offer to be refused. "Carries the healer's bloodline mark of Ravenwood, which grants her standing in this hall not as a ward debt, but as a documented lineage holder under the 3rd provision of the original Pack Covenant." He turned to face the council and the assembled wolves, and when he turned, his voice carried the full reach of the hall. "I name her before this court. Not as ward girl, not as ward debt. As the woman I intend to claim, by open declaration, before these witnesses." Cress made a sound that was not a word, somewhere in the crowd. Mira did not make a sound at all, but her hands were clasped in front of her chest and her eyes were bright. Draven said, "My lord, the political implications of claiming a ward girl over an established noble." "Elder Draven," Elder Soren said, "the council has already found your document invalid. We now find your continued participation in these proceedings inappropriate, given your role in the document's preparation." She looked at the other elders. "The council is taking the matter of the forged seal under formal inquiry. I would ask Elder Draven to remove himself from the proceedings and remain available for questioning." Draven stood for a moment in the hall he had arranged, and the proceeding he had constructed, and the outcome he had been certain of, and then he walked to the door. His footsteps were the loudest thing in the room while he walked, and then he was gone. Lady Vera inclined her head toward Victor, very slightly and very correctly, and then she too moved toward the door, and there was nothing in her posture of the woman who had come expecting confirmation. There was, instead, the particular composure of someone reassembling herself in public and intending to do it well. Sable watched her go and felt something that was not triumph and not satisfaction, and was perhaps simply the absence of a weight she had not known she was carrying. Victor turned back to her. He reached out and took her hand, and the gesture was simple and specific, and not dressed in any of the hall's ceremonial vocabulary because it did not need to be. His hand was warm. She could feel the warmth of it against her fingers, and she thought, briefly and with startling clarity, that she had been cold for 11 years in ways she had correctly attributed to practical matters like underfueled hearths and insufficient winter blankets, and had possibly, she now understood, attributed too exclusively to those things. "You invoked the ward right," he said. "It applied," she said. "It applied," he agreed. The faint thing at the corner of his mouth was not quite a smile. It was the specific expression of a man who has been watching for a particular quality in a particular person and has found it exactly where he expected to find it and is, against all the arrangements of his face, pleased. "I have been looking for you." She thought of the corridor, the order issued to the wolf captain at the south door, spoken by name. "You knew I was here." "I have known for 3 years where you were," he said. "I waited because you were not yet 19, and claiming a ward girl before she came into her full standing was not something I was willing to do." He held her gaze. "I would have waited longer." The hall was still. It was a different stillness than the one that had opened the proceedings. That stillness had been the silence of hierarchy arranging itself to receive a predetermined outcome. This stillness was the silence of a room that has witnessed something it did not predict and is deciding what to make of it. And the decision the room was arriving at, Sable could feel it in the air the way she could feel weather arriving before the first cloud appeared, was not resistance. Elder Soren said from the council dais, in the measured voice of someone who has witnessed enough formal claim proceedings to know when one is complete and when it is not. "The Alpha King has made an open declaration of claim before this council and these witnesses. Does the claimant stand?" Victor looked at Sable. There was nothing procedural in the look. She looked back at him, and then she looked out at the hall. At Mira, who had been her shelter for 11 years and whose face was now the face of someone watching a debt be paid that they had always believed would be paid but had never been entirely certain of the timing. At Cress, who was standing on her toes in the crowd and whose expression said everything that Cress's expressions always said, without any attempt at discretion. At the assembled wolves and titled families and ranked emissaries who had come to watch a king name a consort and were now watching a ward girl from the hall's eastern margin answer the question of whether she stood. She stood. "The claimant stands," she said. Elder Soren brought the formal proceeding to its close in the old cadence that predated Draven's council reorganization by several generations, and the words of it moved through the hall like a tide going out, carrying the weight of everything the morning had held. The inquiry into the forged seal was formally opened. Draven's council seat was formally suspended pending its outcome. Lady Vera's claim was formally withdrawn. The Ravenwood lineage identification was formally entered into the Pack's standing record, which meant that Sable's name appeared, for the first time, in a place where Pack names were kept, and it appeared not as ward debt or ward girl or ward of uncertain origin, but as lineage holder under the third provision of the original Pack covenant, a provision that was older than any of the political arrangements Draven had spent 20 years building on top of it. Mira came to her when the formal proceedings closed and held both her hands for a moment and did not say anything, because Mira's economy with words was one of the constants of Sable's life, and she would not have wanted it otherwise. Cress appeared at her elbow and said, "I told you the gaze in the hall was not scrutiny," with the composure of someone who had been waiting 11 days to say a specific thing and was going to take the moment seriously. Sable said, "You told me nothing of the kind." And Cress said, "I told you something. I was right in the general direction." Which was accurate enough. The days that followed were not simple. The council inquiry into Draven's forgery took 3 sessions, and the testimony of 2 conclave witnesses who had traveled from the Northern Territories, and in the end, the ash and bone seal was traced to a private carver Draven had employed at his own household, a carver who had been given a cast to copy and a fee, to say nothing about it. The council stripped Draven's seat. He left Thornwood Hall before the formal announcement was complete, which was not the departure of a man who had been humbled, Sable thought, but the departure of a man who understood he had run out of procedures to hide behind, which might, in the long arc of things, be the same. Mira was formally named Senior Healer of the Hall, a restoration of a standing she had held before Draven's faction had maneuvered it away from her 8 years prior, which explained certain things about the tightness of Mira's jaw over certain mornings and the economy of her commentary on certain council decisions. She accepted the restoration with the measured composure of someone who had been waiting for the ground to be sound before putting weight on it, and was now reasonably confident it was. Victor came to Mira's workroom on the 3rd morning. He knocked, which was not what kings did, but which was apparently what Victor did, and Sable opened the door and he stood in it, the way he had stood in the corridor archway when Aldrich's wound was done, with his shoulder not quite against the frame, and his attention on her in the way that no longer felt like scrutiny now that she had the correct category for it. "The Ravenwood lineage," he said, "carries a seat on the Healers' Council under the Old Covenant. It has been empty for 11 years. "I know," she said. She had spent 2 days reading the provision records that Elder Soren had sent to Mira's workroom. Reading was something she had always been faster at than people expected of ward girls, because Mira had not made the mistake of assuming she should be slower. "Are you going to take it?" he asked. She thought about the seat on the Healers' Council and what it would mean to occupy it, and what it would require, and what she would be able to do from inside it that she had not been able to do from the hall's eastern margin. She thought about the poisoned arm wounds that came to the corridor 3 days later than they should have, because the wolves who carried them had learned that ward girl healers were not worth the acknowledgement of arriving sooner. "Yes," she said. Something in his face settled. "Good," he said, and then he was quiet for a moment in the particular way he was quiet, like a room that is full rather than empty. "The formal claiming ceremony is in 10 days. Mira will know the form." He paused. "I will know if you need more time." "I do not need more time," she said. The ceremony was smaller than the council proceeding and held a different kind of weight. The formal dress was Mira's work. Plain healer's linen with the Ravenwood mark worked in dark thread at the wrist, because Sable had asked for it that way, and Victor had said the choice was entirely hers. The hall was the same hall. 14 torches. The stone walls that had held the cold of the last 11 years were holding this instead, the warmth of a fire that had been built to last. Cress stood beside her. This was the 3rd time Cress had stood beside her in this hall, and Cress's face had moved through each iteration in a particular way, from the tight-held worry of the first session, to the bright-eyed vigilance of the council morning, to this, a composed and steady presence that was also, unmistakably, trying not to let its composure develop a specific structural problem around the jaw. Mira stood at the hall's south side. Her hands were folded in front of her. When Victor took her hand at the ceremony's center, the claiming words moving through the hall in the old cadence that Elder Soren had restored from the provision records, Sable looked at the mark on her wrist, the pale crescent of the Ravenwood line, which she had worn for 5 years as an apprentice identifier, and for 11 years as something she did not have the correct name for. It looked the same as it had always looked. She looked the same as she had always looked, The hall looked the same. Nothing looked the same. Victor's grip was warm and specific and unhurried, and when the formal words were complete, and the hall's witnesses confirmed by voice the claim they had witnessed, the sound of it filled the stone space. The way sound fills a room when the walls are finally the right shape to carry it. She had stood at the eastern margin of this hall with her back against cold stone and 14 torches for company, and a rational reading she held onto with both hands, and the rational reading had been wrong, and she was glad. Weeks later, early in the morning before the hall fully woke, she stood in the doorway between the corridor and the main hall, with a basin of fresh water in her hands, and the smell of the morning's first hearth fire coming from the far end of the stone room. She had stood in this doorway before. She had stood in it as a ward girl who made herself small to pass through rooms where she did not have standing. She stood in it now as herself. And the difference was not that the doorway had changed, or the hall had changed, or the stone walls had changed. The difference was that the hall knew who she was. From somewhere further in the corridor, she heard Victor's steps, unhurried and deliberate, coming toward the morning the way he did everything, as though he had already thought about it and decided it was worth the time. She stepped through the doorway,